June 26, 1943, 2:47 p.m., 23,000 feet above Forges-les-Eaux, France. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson sat trapped inside a burning cockpit, hydraulic fluid stinging his eyes until they swelled nearly shut, watching a Focke-Wulf FW-190 position itself 50 yards behind his tail. Through the shattered canopy, Arctic wind screamed past at 200 miles per hour, each gust feeling like ice picks driven into his damaged face. Oil from his dying engine had coated the windscreen completely. To see anything, Johnson had to force his head through the 6-inch gap where his canopy had jammed half open, an experience made excruciating by eyes so inflamed they felt like hot coals pressed into his skull. The German pilot, Oberst Egon Meyer, though Johnson didn't know the name yet, held position with mechanical precision. 102 victories, commander of Jagdgeschwader 2, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated killers. Close enough now that Johnson could see the dark outline of his flight helmet through the Focke-Wulf's canopy. Johnson's P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of American aluminum and steel that critics called too heavy to dogfight, had already absorbed more punishment than should have been survivable. The instrument panel was destroyed. Fire had scorched the interior before mysteriously extinguishing itself. Shrapnel fragments were embedded in Johnson's right leg. A 7.92mm round had creased the tip of his nose. The hydraulic system was completely ruptured, leaving him with almost no control authority. All he could do was point the nose vaguely toward England and pray the gradual descent would be slow enough to reach the Channel. But Meyer had other plans. Johnson pressed himself against the single inch of armor plate behind his seat, the only barrier between his spine and what was about to happen. His hands, slick with hydraulic fluid and blood, gripped the useless stick. The Thunderbolt was already a flying wreck. If Meyer opened fire now, Johnson would go down with it. The canopy wouldn't open more than 6 inches. He'd already tried to squeeze through the shattered remains, and his parachute had snagged on twisted metal. There would be no ejection, no bailout, just a 7-ton coffin spiraling into French farmland. What Johnson didn't know, what none of the 48 P-47 pilots who'd started this mission over Villacoublay airfield could have predicted, was that his airplane, this ridiculous jug that Republic aviation engineers had cobbled together around the biggest radial engine in existence, was about to prove something that would change aerial warfare forever. The FW-190's guns began to fire. The problem had started 18 months earlier, in the skies over France and Germany, where American pilots were dying at rates that made strategic bombing nearly unsustainable. P-40 Warhawks couldn't reach bomber altitude. P-39 Airacobras were massacred above 15,000 feet. Early P-38 Lightnings had promise, but suffered catastrophic engine failures in the European cold, and the elegant, liquid-cooled fighters everyone loved, Spitfires, early Mustangs, had a fatal weakness: puncture the glycol cooling system with a single 20mm cannon shell, and the engine seized within minutes. Dead stick. Forced landing in enemy territory. Capture or death. German pilots knew this intimately. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 carried 20mm MG-151 cannons as standard, with some mounting the devastating 30mm MK-1081. Solid hit from a 30mm round could shear a wing off. 2 or 3 20mm strikes to the engine, and you were walking home. If you survived the crash in April and May of 1943, When the P-47 Thunderbolt first entered combat operations, the results seemed to confirm every critic's worst fears: 14 Thunderbolts shot down. Only 3 German kills confirmed. Royal Air Force observers watching from the sidelines suggested diplomatically that perhaps the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of mount. The numbers were devastating. The airplane that was supposed to save bomber crews was getting its own pilots killed at nearly 5-to-1 ratios. But there were anomalies, strange reports filtering back from mechanics inspecting damaged aircraft. Captain Fred Christensen of the 62nd Fighter Squadron landed his P-47 on July 29, 1943, after a mission over occupied France. When ground crews swarmed the aircraft, they stopped counting at 47 bullet holes. 6 of those were from 20mm cannon shells, the kind that typically blew P-40s and P-39s apart in mid-air. Christensen climbed out uninjured. After weeks of intensive repair work, that same P-47 returned to combat operations. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Ralph Johnson, no relation to Robert, brought his Thunderbolt home with an entire cylinder blown off the R-2800 engine 1 of 18 cylinders, just gone, torn away by German fire. Metal fragments had punched through the cowling. Oil streamed from the wound, but the radial engine, with its 17 remaining cylinders arranged in a circle, kept running, kept producing power, kept pulling Johnson west, away from German flak batteries and away from capture, until he crossed the Channel and set down on English soil. The mechanic stood beneath that damaged engine, staring up at the impossible. Any inline engine, Allison, Merlin, Daimler-Benz, would have grenaded itself instantly, but this brutal, unsophisticated radial just absorbed the damage and kept hammering. Something was different about these airplanes. June 26th began as routine. 48 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group launched from England before dawn. Their mission simple: escort B-17 flying fortresses, attacking Villacoublay airfield outside Paris. The bombers had already turned for home when 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s from 2nd Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 26, dropped from altitude like hawks on sparrows. Robert Johnson, flying tail-end position in the 61st Fighter Squadron's formation, never saw them coming. The first 20mm shell exploded inside his cockpit. The detonation was instantaneous, a white flash, followed by the sound of metal fragmenting against metal. The canopy shattered. The instrument panel disintegrated into smoking ruins. Hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying pressurized fluid directly into Johnson's face. The chemical burn was immediate. His eyes began to swell, vision blurring behind tears that his body produced, desperately trying to flush out the caustic liquid. He felt hot wetness on his leg. Blood or hydraulic fluid? He couldn't tell. His nose stung where a machine gun round had carved a shallow trench across the tip. Then fire bloomed in the cockpit. Orange flames licked up from beneath the instrument panel, fed by hydraulic fluid and electrical shorts. Black smoke filled the cramped space. Johnson couldn't breathe without inhaling carbon and chemicals. His lungs spasmed. The Thunderbolt, suddenly uncontrolled, rolled inverted and entered a flat spin, 7 tons of aircraft, tumbling toward the Earth at terminal velocity. Training took over. Johnson yanked the canopy release. The mechanism, damaged by the explosion, ground halfway open, 6 inches, then jammed solid. He pulled harder. The canopy didn't move. Smoke was filling his lungs. He had maybe 30 seconds before he passed out. If he passed out, the spin would continue until the P-47 augured into French soil at 400 miles per hour. He unbuckled his harness and tried to squeeze through the 6-inch gap. His shoulders jammed immediately. He twisted, pushing, forcing his body toward the opening. His parachute pack snagged on twisted metal. He pulled. The parachute wouldn't come free. Below, through breaks in the smoke, Johnson caught glimpses of green farmland, rotating slowly as the Thunderbolt fell 15,000 feet, 14,000, 13,000. Then, as mysteriously as it had started, the fire went out. Oxygen starvation, maybe fuel starvation, some mercy from physics or God. Johnson dropped back into his seat and grabbed the stick with both hands. He pulled. The nose came up sluggishly. The hydraulics were dead, leaving him with only manual control authority. Cables running directly from stick to control surfaces with no power assist. Like steering a truck with no power steering at highway speeds, every input required his full body weight. Slowly, grudgingly, the Thunderbolt came out of the spin. Johnson leveled at 8,000 feet. His eyes had swollen almost completely shut now, narrow slits through which he could barely perceive light and shadow. He tried to wipe the hydraulic fluid away, but it just smeared. His face felt like it was made of raw meat. Through the broken canopy, he stuck his head into the slipstream. 200-mile-per-hour wind directly in his destroyed eyes, because it was the only way to see forward at all. The P-47's nose pointed roughly west, toward England, toward safety. The channel was 80 miles away. That's when the FW-190 appeared. Johnson saw it first as a dark shape materializing from his 6 o'clock, growing larger as it closed distance with predatory patience. The German pilot, Johnson would learn later, this was Oberst Egon Meyer himself, commander of JG-2, 102 aerial victories, recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, positioned his fighter with surgical precision exactly 50 yards behind the crippled Thunderbolt. Textbook firing position, zero deflection angle, point-blank range. Johnson was utterly defenseless. His guns might still work, but he had no way to bring them to bear. The P-47 barely responded to control inputs. He couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't dive away. All he could do was hunch down behind that single inch of armor plate and wait. Meyer opened fire. The sound arrived first, a tearing, ripping noise like canvas shredding at supersonic speed, except the canvas was his airplane's aluminum skin. Then impacts, dozens of them, hundreds, a continuous hammering that made the entire airframe shudder. Johnson felt each hit, transmitted through the structure, through his seat, into his spine. The armor plate behind his head rang like a bell as bullets struck it directly, their kinetic energy absorbed by American steel rather than American flesh. 20mm cannon shells punched through the tail section. Tracers drew red lines past his peripheral vision. The smell of cordite mixed with hydraulic fluid and oil smoke created a toxic cocktail that made Johnson's already abused lungs scream for clean air. Metal fragments pinged around the cockpit interior. The Thunderbolt shook violently. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds of sustained fire. Johnson's hands, still gripping the stick, were white-knuckled and trembling. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in a dogfight, not in a fair fight, but helpless, crippled, executed at point-blank range by one of Germany's best. Then his survival instinct overrode his resignation. His feet, almost without conscious thought, stabbed at the rudder pedals. Left, right, left. The P-47's nose yawed unpredictably. Not much, the hydraulics were gone, but enough. Enough that Meyer's perfect firing solution degraded into a wobbling, weaving target, enough that the German pilot, not expecting resistance from what should have been a dead airplane, overshot. The FW-190 flashed past Johnson's left wing, canopy level with canopy silence. The guns had stopped. Johnson's ears rang in the sudden absence of violence. Through his swollen, burning eyes, Johnson watched the FW-190 slow until it hung in formation beside him, perhaps 20 feet of empty air separating American aluminum from German steel. The Focke-Wulf was pristine. No damage, no smoke, just clean lines and fresh paint. Its pilot was a dark shape behind the greenhouse canopy. Bär eased his fighter forward, pulling slightly ahead so he could see the full length of the Thunderbolt. His head turned, examining the American fighter from nose to tail. Johnson could imagine what he was seeing: shredded metal, gaping holes, smoke stains, hydraulic fluid streaming from ruptured lines, the canopy partially torn away, control surfaces shot full of holes. Then Bär looked directly at Johnson. Their eyes met across 20 feet of French sky at 200 miles per hour. German pilot, American pilot, killer and victim, except the victim wasn't dead. Bär shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure disbelief visible even from this distance. Then he raised his right hand off the throttle and gave a small wave. Not mocking, not aggressive, just acknowledgement. A professional salute from one aviator to another who'd somehow survived the unsurvivable. The FW-190 banked away. Johnson allowed himself 3 seconds of relief, 3 seconds of thinking maybe, impossibly, he might actually make it home. Then the FW-190 reappeared in his 6 o'clock. No. God, no. Bär had circled back, repositioned. The professional courtesy was over. This was combat, and combat had rules, and those rules said you didn't leave wounded enemy fighters to limp home and fight another day, you finished the job. Johnson hunched behind the armor plate again. His shoulders drew up instinctively, as if making himself smaller might somehow help. The P-47 was already a flying sieve. How much more could it take? How many more bullets before something critical finally failed, before the engine seized, before the wing spar cracked, before the entire tail section just detached? Bär fired. The second attack was worse than the first. The German pilot, knowing now exactly where his target was and that it couldn't maneuver, took his time, methodical, professional. The kind of shooting that comes from 102 previous victories, each one teaching lessons about exactly where to aim, exactly how long to hold the trigger, exactly how to kill efficiently. Cannon shells walked up the fuselage. Machine gun rounds stitched patterns across the wings. A 20mm round exploded against the engine cowling. Johnson felt the impact through the airframe, a deep concussive thump that meant internal damage, meant metal fragments tearing through cylinder heads and push rods and the delicate machinery that kept the R-2800 running. Oil pressure fluctuated, engine temperature spiked. The prop began to windmill unevenly. But the engine didn't stop. 18 cylinders, each one capable of operating independently, each one basically a separate small engine arranged in a radial pattern around the crankshaft, redundancy through brute force engineering. 2 or 3 cylinders could die, and the other 15 would just keep firing, keep driving the prop, keep pulling this ridiculous airplane through the air. The punishment continued. 20 seconds, 30 seconds, longer than the first pass. Bär was emptying his ammunition bays, every round he had left, into this single, stubborn Thunderbolt that refused to die. Glass shattered. Metal screamed. Something hot grazed Johnson's shoulder. A fragment of his own airplane turned into shrapnel by German guns. Now wounding him from the inside, he could taste blood. Whether his own, or from bitten tongue, or from lungs damaged by smoke inhalation, he didn't know. Then silence again. The FW-190 pulled alongside for the second time. Mayer's head turned toward Johnson, and even from this distance, even through eyes swollen nearly shut, Johnson could see the German pilot's expression. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to amazement. Wonder. The kind of face someone makes when witnessing something that violates their understanding of how physics works. This time, Mayer didn't wave. He just stared. Staring at bullet holes that should have been fatal. Staring at an engine that should have quit. Staring at a pilot who should have been tumbling toward Earth in a parachute, or more likely, dead in the wreckage of a crashed fighter. The FW-190 banked away again. Johnson knew with absolute certainty that Mayer would come back. Third time. 3 was the pattern, 3 passes, the first to wound, the second to kill, the third to confirm the kill. He'd seen German pilots do it before, watched them circle burning wrecks just to be sure. Sure enough, the FW-190 reappeared. But this time, Mayer didn't position at Johnson's 6 o'clock. Instead, he flew a wide, sweeping approach from the left quarter, setting up for a deflection shot, a sweep pass, wing to wing. The kind of attack that let you rake the entire length of the target aircraft, nose to tail, guaranteeing hits on every critical system. Johnson couldn't do anything but sit there and take it. Mayer opened fire while still in a gentle bank, walking his tracers across empty air, adjusting, refining, until the stream of bullets and cannon shells connected with the P-47's left wing. Then he smoothly traversed right, nose gently swaying, letting physics and training guide the bullets across the Thunderbolt's entire wingspan. Every part of the airplane was hit. The left wing shredded, fuel tanks ruptured, mercifully not exploding, just venting avgas into the slipstream where it atomized into mist. The cockpit area took more hits. Johnson felt impacts on the armor plate, felt the whole airplane shudder like a boxer absorbing body blows. The right wing disintegrated in sections, aluminum skin peeling back to reveal structural spars underneath. The control stick went mushy. Cables had been cut. Johnson had almost no control authority remaining. The P-47 was flying itself now, or rather, falling in a controlled manner that only coincidentally resembled Flight 40 seconds. A lifetime, an eternity of metal-on-metal violence. Then finally, silence. Real silence this time. Not the pause between attacks, but the silence of completion, of empty ammunition bays, of a warrior who'd given everything and achieved nothing. The Thunderbolt was still airborne, still flying, still pointed vaguely toward England. The FW-190 appeared alongside for a third time. Mayer stared for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he rocked his wings, the universal aviation signal for respect, for acknowledgement, for well fought. His fighter pulled away, climbing slightly, turning back toward German-controlled airspace, where he'd need to explain to his commander how he'd expended all his ammunition on a single target, and that target had escaped. Johnson watched him go. Watched until the FW-190 was just a speck against clouds, until it disappeared entirely. Only then did Johnson take inventory. He tried counting bullet holes in the sections of wing he could see from the cockpit. He gave up after 200. And that was just the port wing. The starboard side was probably worse. The fuselage had to be Swiss cheese. The tail section, assuming it was still attached, God only knew his eyes were swelling shut completely now. The hydraulic fluid had done permanent damage that would take weeks to heal, but he could still see light and shadow, could still perceive the difference between earth and sky. He stuck his head into the slipstream again, letting the 200-mile-per-hour wind blast his damaged face because pain meant awareness, and awareness meant survival. 70 miles to the channel. 60. 50. The R-2800 kept running. Oil pressure was low. Temperature was high. The engine knocked and coughed and made sounds no radial engine should make. But it ran. 18 cylinders of cast iron and aluminum, each one independently bolted to the crankcase, each one self-contained, kept firing. Some of the cylinders were probably dead, just dead weight being carried around by the survivors. Didn't matter. The living cylinders compensated. Johnson called ground control on the radio. Miracle of miracles, it still worked. And they vectored him toward Manston, a forward airfield on England's southeast coast with extra-long runways built for emergency landings exactly like this, no flaps. The hydraulic system was gone. No wheel brakes. Also hydraulic. The landing would be fast and uncontrolled, and if he hit anything on the runway, the laws of physics would finally get their due and turn 7 tons of damaged aluminum into a fireball. The English coast appeared through his ruined windscreen. White cliffs, green fields, the most beautiful sight Johnson had ever seen. He set up final approach at 160 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour faster than normal because without flaps, the wing generated less lift. The runway filled his forward vision. He pulled the stick back, flaring, bleeding off speed, and the P-47 settled onto concrete with a teeth-rattling impact that sent pain shooting through his wounded leg, 140 miles per hour. Still rolling, no brakes. The runway had parked aircraft at the far end, P-47s being serviced, their pilots probably drinking tea and complaining about the food. Johnson stood on the rudder pedals, using differential braking from the tail wheel, trying to slow down before he plowed through $250,000 worth of Republic Aviation's finest 100 miles per hour. 90, 80, 70. The P-47 shuddered to a stop 50 feet from a row of parked fighters. Johnson sat motionless for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the stick, afraid that if he moved, the airplane might somehow remember it was supposed to be dead and collapse around him. Medical personnel were already sprinting across the tarmac, ground crew right behind them. Their faces, when they reached the aircraft, told Johnson everything. Whatever they were seeing was bad. He popped the canopy. The damaged mechanism finally gave up completely, and the whole assembly fell away. Someone brought a ladder. Johnson tried to stand and found his legs wouldn't support him. Strong hands grabbed him under the shoulders and lifted him from the cockpit. His boots touched ground. Real ground. English soil. Not French farmland, seen from a falling aircraft, but solid earth, where people spoke English and the bullets weren't aimed at him. A crew chief walked around the P-47, clipboard in hand, counting damage. He stopped after 200 holes, just on the port side. "Sir," he said to the maintenance officer, "this bird isn't repairable. This is salvage." Someone took a photograph. In it, Johnson stands beside his P-47, face swollen almost beyond recognition, one eye completely closed, the other barely a slit. His flight suit is stained with hydraulic fluid and blood. Behind him, the Thunderbolt. Looks like it flew through a metal shredder. Daylight is visible through dozens of holes. The tail section hangs at an odd angle. The wings are shredded. The engine cowling is torn open, revealing internal damage that should have resulted in catastrophic failure thousands of feet ago. The airplane was scrapped, but Robert Johnson returned to combat 3 weeks later. He'd fly another 155 missions over the next year, his score steadily climbing. By the time he completed his tour and rotated home in May 1944, he had 27 confirmed aerial victories, the first American pilot in the European theater to break Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record of 26 kills. The German pilot who'd tried to kill him that day, Oberst Egon Mayer, wouldn't survive the war. He died in combat on March 2, 1944, shot down during a massive air battle over Germany, 102 victories. Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of the Luftwaffe's finest. But even he couldn't kill a P-47. Word of Johnson's survival spread through Luftwaffe squadrons like a virus. German pilots began reporting the same phenomenon. They'd hit a Thunderbolt, watch their bullets strike home, see pieces fly off, and the American fighter would just keep coming. One Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his combat report, "The Thunderbolt does not die. You hit it, see your rounds connecting, but it continues flying." Heinz Bär, a German ace with 220 victories, admitted after the war, no other fighter could absorb that kind of damage. Another German pilot's report was more poetic. "The Americans' weapons don't merely damage aircraft, they disintegrate them. We watched experienced pilots simply vanish in clouds of debris. No opportunity for ejection, no chance of survival, just instant destruction from concentrated fire." When German forces captured an intact P-47 in late 1943, engineers at the Rechlin test facility tore it apart, trying to understand the secret. What they found was brutally simple: redundancy and weight. The R-2800 engine could lose multiple cylinders and continue operating. The airframe was overbuilt, spars and stringers thick enough to absorb battle damage that would tear a Bf-109 or FW-190 apart. The cockpit armor was twice as thick as German equivalents, and the fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled when punctured, closing holes automatically. General Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighter forces, examined the captured P-47's cockpit and wrote that it was large enough to walk around inside. He wasn't exaggerating by much. Compared to the cramped Bf-109, where pilots sat with knees nearly touching the instrument panel, the Thunderbolt's interior was a cathedral one. German pilots speculated, half-joking, that American pilots could probably dodge bullets by simply unstrapping and leaning to one side. Tactical recommendations circulated through Luftwaffe squadrons. Engage P-47s only below 15,000 feet, where their climb rate was poor. Never dive away from them. The Thunderbolt could reach speeds in excess of 500 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any German fighter, and most importantly, don't assume a damaged P-47 is finished. Pilots reported shooting Thunderbolts until they ran out of ammunition, only to watch the American fighters continue toward England. The statistics eventually told the full story. P-47. Thunderbolts were lost at a rate of 0.7% per mission, 7 aircraft per 1,000 sorties. For context, that meant a P-47 pilot could fly 142 combat missions and, statistically, expect to survive every single one. Compare that to German pilot survival rates, which steadily collapsed as the war progressed. By 1944, new Luftwaffe pilots had a life expectancy measured in hours. The Americans were producing 1,500 fighters per month. Germany's entire aviation industry produced 300. Republic Aviation's single factory on Long Island built more P-47s than Germany, built Bf-109s and FW-190, combined 15,683. Thunderbolts rolled off American production lines between 1942 and 1945. They flew 546,000 combat sorties. They destroyed 11,878 enemy aircraft, roughly half in the air, half on the ground. They demolished 9,000 locomotives, 160,000 vehicles, 6,000 armored vehicles. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. They fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. And the top 10 P-47 aces, the 10 pilots with the most aerial victories, all survived the war. Every single one. No other fighter aircraft in World War II could make that claim. Francis Gabby Gabreski became the highest-scoring P-47 ace with 28 confirmed kills, later revised to 31. He flew 166 combat missions. He was finally shot down not by a German fighter, but by his own overconfidence. On July 20th, 1944, while strafing ground targets, he flew too low and clipped his propeller on the ground. The blades bent. The engine seized. He crash-landed and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. But he survived. Even crashing a P-47 wasn't necessarily fatal. After the war, when military historians analyzed combat effectiveness, they found something unexpected. Surveys showed that P-51 Mustang pilots preferred their aircraft above all others. But an equal percentage of P-47 pilots believed their airplane was superior. Not because it was faster or more maneuverable, but because when the shooting started, when the sky filled with steel and lead and high explosive, the Thunderbolt brought them home. The airplane that critics called too fat to dogfight, and the Jug and the 7-ton fighter bomber ended the war with a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. For every P-47 lost in combat, more than 4 German aircraft were destroyed, not through elegance or speed or dogfighting prowess, but through the same brutal philosophy that built America's industrial base. If you can't make it better, make it stronger. Today, a handful of P-47s still fly at air shows, maintained by collectors who spend fortunes keeping 75-year-old Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engines operational. When one of those Thunderbolts starts up, the sound is unmistakable. A deep, throaty roar that resonates in your chest, 18 cylinders hammering in synchronized violence that somehow sounds like protection, like safety, like survival. Several P-47s are preserved in museums. The National World War II Museum has one. The Smithsonian has one. England's RAF Museum has one. None of them are Robert Johnson's aircraft. That one was scrapped in 1943, too damaged to ever fly again. But they all carry the same DNA. Heavy, inelegant, overbuilt, too fat to dogfight. Until you needed something that refused to die. Robert Johnson lived until December 1998. He died at 78, surrounded by family, in a hospital bed far from French skies and German guns. At his funeral, fellow P-47 pilots from the 56th Fighter Group remembered not his 27 kills or his Presidential Unit citation or his Distinguished Flying Cross. They remembered June 26, 1943, the day he should have died, the day Egon emptied every gun, every cannon, every round of ammunition into a single P-47, and that P-47 just kept flying, because Republic aviation engineers, when told to build a fighter, built something else instead. They built a flying fortress of one. They built redundancy and weight and armor. They built an airplane that couldn't turn with a zero, couldn't dogfight a FW-190, couldn't match a Spitfire's grace. But when the metal started flying and men started dying, when elegance met brutality and sophistication met violence, the Thunderbolt just kept hammering through. Too heavy to dogfight, too stubborn to die. 7 tons of American engineering that made one simple promise: bring your pilot home no matter what. And for 15,000 pilots, over 546,000 missions, that promise held.